All right, everyone. So in this video, I'm going to continue the discussion on cell respiration, right? And in the previous recording, I was talking about cellular respiration and moreover aerobic respiration. So if you notice, there's a letter B here, right? Aerobic respiration was letter A, right, or point A, which was divided into glycolysis, that pyruvate oxidation, Krebs cycle, and then the electron transport chain. In this short video, I'm going to talk about anaerobic respiration, which is a type of respiration that occurs in the absence of oxygen, right? So continuing on, this is section 10.7.2, right? I'll go over the two types of anaerobic respiration, okay? Again, anaerobic meaning the absence of oxygen. Okay, so generally the organisms that do this include, plants, humans, bacteria, right, and so forth. And generally this occurs in the cytosol. Okay, organisms that use this process are generally called anaerobes and live in anaerobic conditions where there's little to no oxygen, right? That is referred to as an anaerobic condition. And there's two types of anaerobic respiration, which can be called fermentation also, right? And there's alcohol fermentation and there's lactic acid fermentation, right? And eukaryotes can do, depending on the type of eukaryote, can do, one of these types of fermentation there. Okay, and again, it happens in the cytosol, and it begins with glycolysis, right? And so what's happening is that glucose can turn into, another byproduct aside from pyruvate, right? And to produce ATP or to regulate NADH, right, for the Krebs cycle and so forth, right? So you have these two types of anaerobic respirations, also called fermentation. And yeah, this fermentation is that common, concept whenever you're baking food. This is actually the process that bakers use to create food, right? To create bread, right? So let's take a look at each of them. The first one is called alcoholic fermentation or alcohol fermentation. And microorganisms can do this, such as yeast, right? Fungi. Prokaryotes could do this process. Bacteria can do this. And also plants can do this, right? And the name tells you what it essentially produces, which is an alcohol. More specifically, ethanol, right? So it produces ethanol and carbon dioxide as an output, right? So that breakdown of glucose forming ethanol, right? C2H5OH, right? And I apologize for these numbers here, that they should be not lowercase, but yeah, in a lower, right? That lower font here in the bottom, right? C2H5OH, right? Plus carbon dioxide plus 2 ATP, right? Subscript, that was the word, right? So they're producing a small amount of ATP, and it's definitely not as much as aerobic respiration, but it's enough for them to be producing some form of energy. Okay, so this pathway to produce ATP is used a lot for commercial reasons, essentially to produce wine, beer, bread also, right? You use this metabolic pathway essentially to make alcoholic beverages, right? Like wine. But organisms really can't rely on this anaerobic respiration for too long, because ethanol, if it starts accumulating too much in the body or in cells individually, it can become toxic for the cell. So the cell could actually kill itself, right? So to say. So either it processes it or it could be damaging for the cell. So it could be toxic, right? So you don't want to rely on this chemical reaction for too long, right? Alcohol fermentation. Okay. And then you have another type of fermentation, and this is more for animals, right? Including humans, we undergo this pathway. And similarly, right, you break down glucose to produce what is called lactic acid and plus 2 ATPs, right? Now, but you may think, wait a minute, we're breathing in oxygen, we're aerobic organisms, and our body's having oxygen. That while that is true, there are instances or there are moments that maybe you're doing strenuous exercise, very intense exercise, and the muscles, as you're doing more exercise, you need more oxygen, and more cells, more muscle cells need more oxygen. And sometimes it happens that your muscles are working more than the oxygen that your lungs can provide the muscles, right, in a given time. So not all the tissues are getting oxygen available to them. So they have to rely on another process to continuously produce ATP because they still need the energy and they still need oxygen, right? But oxygen isn't going everywhere to every single cell, in the body. So they need to rely on another form to obtain, and another process to obtain energy, right? So this is what I'm referring to as this second sentence here. It occurs when the body requires more ATP than what aerobic respiration can produce and what oxygen can be relayed, to every single cell. So this process basically results in a compound called lactic acid. Okay, so in this case, glucose isn't broken down completely as it is in aerobic respiration all the way to carbon dioxide. So, of course, because of that, you'll get less energy output, right? A smaller amount of ATP. In this case, you have 2 molecules of ATP, right? And aside from that, you're getting lactic acid that is accumulating in the body, right? And this lactic acid is the reason why we tend to get muscle soreness, right? So our body, especially if you haven't done strenuous exercise in a long time, your body will, rely on this metabolic process, right, to produce more ATP. And a result of that is the accumulation of lactic acid. And that is what makes you feel sore, that chemical, right? Eventually it goes away. Your body breaks down lactic acid and the soreness goes away, right? So ultimately, it's that process here. All right. And you can see a general overview now of aerobic and anaerobic pathways, ultimately depending on the presence of oxygen, right? If you have oxygen present, glucose will undergo the process of glycolysis, which will either go into the mitochondria, right, and ultimately produce, go through aerobic respiration, the citric acid cycle, and the electron transport chain, which will produce a high output of energy, right, of ATP, around 38 ATP, right? And then you can also undergo, this form of glycolysis where more specifically, you're getting this pyruvate, which will undergo fermentation, either producing lactic acid or alcohol and carbon dioxide, basically alcoholic fermentation. Okay, so depending again of the presence of oxygen. Okay, so this little table can summarize fairly well, what is the difference between these two processes. So make sure you understand this table here, very, very important, to distinguish differences between the two, right? Compare and contrast, find similarities and differences. Okay, very, very important to study. And the last part, basically summarizing everything up, is essentially, what is the relationship between photosynthesis and cell respiration, right? Before I get into that, just one last concept here is factors that affect the rate of respiration, very similar to photosynthesis. If you understood what factors affect photosynthesis, then you should understand also the concepts of what factors affect the rate of respiration, right? One of them, of course, being temperature. As you may know, temperature increases, the rate of reactions do increase, the amount of collisions increase, and interactions between molecules increase, but only to a certain point where if you increase the temperature too much, right, the rate of reaction will decrease again. Why? Ultimately becomes because enzymes will become denatured again, right? And denaturation will occur, so enzymatic activity will decrease. Of course, also in terms of concentrations and usage, right? Glucose, the more glucose you have, you will increase the rate of the reaction for cell respiration, but only until a certain point, right? You will reach a point that there's just an optimum saturation where just you need time for the reaction to occur and forward and glucose to break down before you can continue again, right? And similarly with oxygen, right? You can pump in as much as oxygen as you want, but it takes time for the oxygen to be consumed, right, and turned into water. Okay, so you'll reach a saturation point. Okay, similar factors that affect the rate of respiration. And lastly, in terms of this relationships, um, cell respiration and photosynthesis, depending on the organisms, right? Some organisms can do both, right, because they have chloroplasts and mitochondria. Right, these are generally the autotrophs that have both organelles, so they can perform photosynthesis and cell respirations. But even some plants, different parts of the plant, doesn't necessarily have chloroplasts, like the root cells, right? They're inside the soil, so how can they photosynthesize if they're deep down underground, right? So they rely on different parts of the plant to supply them with glucose, right, or ATP, right? So heterotrophs are completely dependent on photosynthesizers, right, to get glucose so they can burn that into ATP, right? But ultimately, there is a relationship where the products of one become the reactants of the other. If you see photosynthesis here, ultimately having sunlight coming in, inducing, the light reactions to essentially produce oxygen, right? The light independent reactions producing glucose. These are basically end products which would be used in aerobic respiration, where glucose is broken down into pyruvate, entering aerobic respiration, where along with oxygen in the electron transport chain, it's used, it essentially produces carbon dioxide and water, right? So these products from cellular respiration, carbon dioxide and water, ultimately leave the heterotroph, for example, and would go to a autotroph here to be photosynthesized, or even within the same individual, right? This process occurs. So ultimately, the products of one reaction become the reactants of the other. Okay, and there is a particular in terms of the amount, right? Whenever you have the uptake, right, in photosynthesis, and these are generally for autotrophs, that rate of uptake of carbon dioxide for photosynthesis, whenever you have that same rate as the output of photosynthesis of oxygen, basically these two are hand in hand, right? The input equals the output. That is referred to as a compensation point, right? You essentially have a balance between the two molecules, right? So there's a nice balance between photosynthesis and cell respiration. You've reached a point of balance, right? It's referred to as compensation point. Okay. In terms of the topic test and the overall ATAR and unit examination, definitely you should know differences and similarities between photosynthesis and aerobic respiration. Know the sites at which reactions are occurring, right? What are the necessary material in order for it to happen? What are the outputs, right? And what type of energy is needed and what type of energy is created. Basically, light energy converted into chemical energy, which is ATP, and so forth. So put a little star on this. And also differences between anaerobic and aerobic respiration, right? Put a little star on that table too for you to understand. You definitely need to know similarities and differences. Okay, so with that being said, this finishes chapter 10, which is everything on enzymes, ATP, photosynthesis, and cell respiration. Okay, thank you guys for listening.